Dr. Clare Walker is the Manager of Public Programs and a Master Naturalist at Irvine Nature Center in Owings Mills, Maryland. There, she installs and maintains wildlife-friendly native plant gardens and shares her expertise with visitors. Welcome, Clare.
Hello. So welcome, everyone. I'm happy that everyone's able to join me on this unusually snowy morning in March. But next week, we're going to be right back into actual spring weather, and I will be starting planting next week. So that's pretty exciting. So welcome. Today we're going to be talking about supporting pollinators in spring. And we're going to learn lots about both the insects themselves, and then really focus on what you can do as you start to prepare your garden this spring for the pollinators. So I'm just going to give you a really brief introduction to why we want to help pollinators. We're going to look at who the pollinators you're most likely to see in spring are. And then we're going to get into the real nitty gritty of the talk, which is your spring cleanup. And one of the things I really like about talking about caring for pollinators is what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask you to put your feet up at times and do a little bit less yard work than maybe you have done in previous years. And so by being a slightly lazier gardener, you could actually do a lot more for our pollinators. And then we're going to get into some beautiful pictures of some of the plants, and that I hope will inspire you to go rushing out and add some new plants to your yard. So I'm sure we all know that the reason we're here today is because pollinators are so important for our food. Most of you might have heard that 1 in 3 bites of our food are due to a pollinator. And so at this time of year, the things that the pollinators are going to get ready to do is a lot of pollination of our fruit trees, creating the things that we really like to eat. But I'm going to talk about a lot of pollinators that are sort of under thought about, and it's the pollinators that are actually hard at work pollinating our native plants that produce all the food and seeds for next year of plants used by wildlife. So without pollinating these plants, we would gradually lose all of our butterflies and birds and, the mammals that rely on the food that's created by our native plants. So who are we going to be talking about today? Well, the really big focus in spring is the bees. They are the first emerging of the pollinators and do most of the spring pollinators. We will talk a little bit about butterflies, but really, the butterfly season, it tends to be a little later in the year than our springtime. And the first arrivals of hummingbirds are also going to happen this spring. But most of our other pollinators, the moths, the flies, the beetles, and the wasps are actually later pollinators. So they're not going to get as much talk about them in this talk. So obviously the reason that I was probably asked to talk to you today is that everyone is starting to get a little bit worried about research such as the one that I've got up here that shows that there's been such a massive decline. And this is, research done just in the last decade. We're looking at declines of nearly 50% in our pollinators of butterflies and bees worldwide. And this is a pretty startling kind of figure, and certainly should make anyone take pause and think about what's their role in supporting these pollinators that are so vital both for us and for the natural world. We really will have a completely different world if we lose these pollinators. And just to bring it to a local focus right here, and a lot of my figures are from Maryland, but they're very applicable even if you're in the Virginia area as well. So one of the pollinators that I'm going to talk today about, bumblebees, there used to be 15 species known in Maryland. And of those 15, 5 of them are still common, but unless you go out of your way, you'll probably only ever see 3 of those bumblebees. And 4 have been lost completely from the state. and 6 of the others are threatened. They're considered at risk of disappearing from the state. So as you can see, it's happening locally as well as worldwide. And who doesn't like fruit? It's such an important thing to keep these pollinators going so that, we can enjoy literally the fruits of their work. Now, when I talk about bees to, audiences, from when I go into schools or just the general public, as soon as you say the word bees, people start thinking about honey and waggle dances and, of course, the big hive. And what they're thinking about is the European honeybee, which is, a really important agricultural worker. Is regulated by the Maryland Department of Agriculture because it's considered livestock. And this bee's job is to pollinate a lot of fruits. And our vegetables. But if I ask you to draw a bee, most people actually draw a very charismatic fuzzy bumblebee, and that we're going to learn lots more about that one today. So I could do like a comparison between European honeybees and the bees that I'm really going to focus on today, are native bees that are the ones that really need help. And that's because the honeybees are kind of known that they will protect those hives. If you get too close to them, they can sting, they can cause allergies, and they cause kind of people to have some anxiety around bees. But one of the things that I want you to be really aware of in terms of attracting bees to your yard, the native bees that I'm going to be talking about encouraging today, for the most part, most of them can't sting. Only the largest of the bees, like the bumblebees, are capable of stinging people. And even if they do sting, native bees don't cause allergies. All the allergic reaction is actually related to the European honeybees. So if you do have allergies, I encourage you don't install the European honeybee hives, but it is safe to have native bees in your yard. And one of the things, there's a lot of talk about, bees being in danger, but the European honeybee is not at risk of becoming endangered. There's probably more European honeybees in the world than there's ever been. And they have a lot of issues with disease and mites, but we breed them in vast facilities and they are not in danger any more than chickens or cows are of going extinct. But many of our native species are at risk of disappearing. And that's why today I'm going to be really talking about how we can support them. So if you've seen me talk before, I know I did a talk last fall, you might know I talked about all the diversity that there are of bees. And in Maryland and Virginia, we actually have about 450 different species of native bees. They come in all colors, as you can see here, and they come in a huge range of sizes. So our biggest bee that will be emerging this spring is the carpenter bee here that you can see here, and I've compared its size to a quarter. Don't worry, it's not as big as it's looking on your screen at the moment. It's a little larger than a quarter. So that's our largest bee. But the vast majority of native bees are much, much smaller. In fact, they're only about as big as the eye of a carpenter bee, or if you're still looking at that quarter, they're about the length of George Washington's nose on that quarter. And that's why I was saying most of our native bees aren't capable of stinging you, because their stingers are just way too small to be able to get through human skin. And more importantly, they don't want to sting you because they don't have that big hive with lots of honey in to protect like the honeybees do. So, looking outside today, are we going to see any bees? Indeed, there are no bees outside today, and there weren't last week. So, where are all the bees? The European honeybees are just snug inside those hives eating honey today, but our native bees are somewhere different. And where they are depends on where they nest. So they're still in their overwintering nests at the moment, ready to emerge. So some of our bees are going to be in the ground at the moment. Some of them are in cavities that we're going to talk about. And then our social bees are in slightly different places. So we're going to look at these different habits of the bees. So when will you see our first bees coming out? So if you want to know, like, when should I start looking for them? They mostly start to appear when the red maples start to bloom. So anytime after that, our first bees start to emerge. So we're going to focus first on the social bees, our bumble bees, which is kind of like the charismatic teddy bear of the bee world because they're just so fluffy and cute looking. Now, their life cycle, though, is very different to what we think of if you know anything about honeybees. They actually spend the winter as solitary queen females underground. And so anytime now, this next week, I suspect the first of those bumblebees will start to crawl out of their underground hibernation areas, and they're going to be out looking for the first spring flowers. And the queen is going to be hunting for a place to build her hive. It can be underground like this, often in old like chipmunk nests, mouse nests, things like that, because they want an insulated area, or sometimes in the base of grasses with like thick sort of clumps of tall grasses. So you might first see a bumblebee just kind of walking around on the ground looking for a place to make those nests. And there's quite a lot of competition between all the emerging queens to find the best place to make their nest, because they want a place that's like warm and fuzzy, and because they have to keep their eggs nice and warm if they're able to develop. So for that's the queens in spring, they have to work incredibly hard. They've got to collect a huge pile of pollen. They lay their eggs on top of the pollen. And then they build a little nectar pot of honey that's just for them. It's not enough for us to ever collect, but they use this to feed on bad weather days. So if any had emerged before this and they were caught with a late snowstorm like today, they would be feeding off their nectar pot. And they have to keep those eggs at about 70 degrees Fahrenheit. So they actually lay on top of their eggs and they shiver to raise the temperature of those eggs to about 70 degrees so that they can hatch. So what are they eating at this time of year? Well, mostly it's those maples that I talked about, and then willows, the first trees that are out blooming at this time of year. And we really should focus on taking care of our bumblebees because they are really important pollinators. They can do a special thing called buzz pollination that plants like this tomato needs. And as you can see on this flower, you cannot see where the stamen are with the pollen. The stamen are hidden inside this tube, and the bees need a special way to access that pollen and pollinate bee tomato plants. Bumblebees also have incredibly long tongues, and so there's some plants that only they have a long enough tongue to get into and pollinate. And there's also a whole load of plants that have this kind of a closed flower, and they need a big strong bee like a bumblebee to push them open. So we're going to just have a quick peek at what buzz pollination looks like. So you can get an idea of what these plants get up to. I'm just going to take us through to the buzz pollination part. So They can do this amazing form of pollination by literally unhooking the wings from their body in order to shake those flowers so hard. And lots of our crops need this buzz pollination. So they're really important pollinators, including the springtime plant of our blueberries. So we're going to mention those again later. But there's also a lot of wild plants, some of our most spectacular spring flowering plants, from the shooting stars to the orchids like these lady slippers, wild blue indigo, and then Dutchman's breeches all need the special talents of bumblebees in order to get pollinated in the springtime. Okay, our second group of bees I'm going to talk about is the ground nesting bees. So ground nesting bees are actually the most common type of bees. 70% of them nest in the ground. And when I say ground nesting bees, often there's a bit of a reaction because people sometimes associate ground nesting bees as the bees that fly out of the ground when they're maybe, mowing their lawns to fly out to sting them. But it's really important to remember that the bees I'm talking about are solitary, very calm, non-aggressive bees that just live as a single mom with a single hole. The bees that fly out of the ground to attack you are actually not bees. It's yellow jackets that live in a large social nest under the ground here, and they will fly out and defend their large colonies. Okay, so it's really important if people tell me, oh, I got attacked by ground bees. It wasn't actually bees, it's ground nesting wasps that were the issue. And so if you're thinking, oh, do I have these bees in my yard? They are a very attractive kind of bee. They have a really shapely body, so large abdomen, narrow waist, and then they have kind of these eyebrows that run next to their eyes. So sometimes when you look down on them from the top, you can see the hair running next to their eyes. And they can have shiny abdomens like this, or they can have some striping. So as I say, they nest under the ground. The female dig these deep tunnels, and then they dig an individual cell for their each of their offspring, and they fill that with a ball of pollen and lay an egg on each one. And those babies will never meet their mums. They're going to stay underground for an entire year and then emerge next spring. So the ones that we will see soon have been underground since last spring. And some of these Andrena bees are very important because they have very special relationships with some of our spring flowers, and they will collect pollen only from a single type of flower, such as this spring beauty bee. So the spring beauty flower really relies on this bee because she's such a reliable pollinator. The only type of flower she's going to visit is these spring beauties. So if you lose the flower, you lose the bee, and sometimes the other way as well. And we actually have a lot of our spring flowering plants have these special relationships, from Jacob's ladder, which is a lovely plant to have in your yard, golden ragwort that we'll talk about later, and a wild geranium, among others. So our final group of bees is the cavity nesting bees, and these are really well known in spring because these are the mason bees, and they really focus on visiting spring blossoms, particularly like apples and cherries and peaches. So they're often known as the blue orchard bees. And these are the ones that nest in cavities, but they don't create them themselves. They have to have them supplied. And they build the walls within the nest using mud. So you might also see these bees visiting kind of wet mud areas. And you can encourage these bees by actually adding a fake mud area within your own yard, just by having a little tray, putting some mud in, and then having a way to add water, without having it floating on the surface, so that they can safely land and collect mud. So they are very identifiable, these bees, because they actually carry their pollen on their abdomens dry. So on those tummies, they have hairy tummies, and that's where they collect all this pollen. And that's the reason they are actually great pollinators, because when they land on a flower, they kind of land onto the flower and then kind of smush across the flower with all those hairs on this underside. the pollen rubbing off from them onto the stigma of the apple blossom or the peach blossom, making sure they get really well pollinated. And then, like I said, they raise their young inside these tubes. So taking care of these bees really, is an important backup to if we have issues with our European honeybees. These bees are able to, make sure that these crops are still available for us. So now we're going to really focus on what you can do as you're cleaning up your yard this spring to help bees and other pollinators. So I'm going to run through 5 different things we can do, with the first 4 being, how you clean up your yard this spring. And then we're going to talk about the plants themselves. So these bees, one of the things that they like is, most of them, as I said, 70% of them are ground nesting. And if you have a meticulous lawn with really dense turf, and then every area of your yard that would have bare soil is covered with mulch, you actually have no places where these bees can build their nests. So, but by having lawns that have, just as you can see, this is still lawn area here, but there's a small area of bare ground between the grasses, and these bees have crawled around and they dug a little hole to lay their nest within their grasses. So if you have natural lawn care and don't cover your lawns with a lot of fertilizers and herbicides, you will find over time that you actually have these perfect conditions for these bees, that there'll be some areas that have bare soil that allow the bees to form their nests. So a lot of the bees also just go under leaf areas. So you need to have areas of your lawn, not your lawn, under the trees and shrubs where you leave leaf litter through the winter. And if you saw my full presentation, you will understand that I probably mentioned about 20 times how important leaf litter is for protecting our pollinators. So yeah, it gives them a place to sneak underneath and dig those holes out of sight from any potential predators. So just to reiterate what I talked about last fall, lots of our important pollinators and beautiful moths like this one here are living in that litter. So tucked inside of this leaf here is a cocoon of the lunar moths. So if you clean up your leaves either in fall or early in spring before these moths have a chance to emerge, all of those beautiful moths and butterflies are going to disappear wherever you send your leaves off to. So to support those cavity nesting bees, what they want is hollow stemmed plants that they can dig their own little tubes into to make their nests. So there's lots of things that you can grow in your yard that have hollow stems and that you might be just interested in having anyway, like raspberries or elderberries, because of the benefits that they provide to people. But many different of the large plants like Joe Pye weeds and then goldenrods have hollow stems that allow these bees to make their homes in those stems. If you have space, some of them just dig their stems into kind of rotting logs. So if you have branches that fall and you could just place them in an area, I actually use mine to line a little pathway that I have within a tiny wooded area at the side of my yard. And so then those, as they slowly decompose, the bees can dig into them to eat the to form a nest for their babies. So people often ask me, when can they clean up? They listen to my talk in fall about leaving the leaves and not cutting back everything and leaving the nest. And so when in the springtime, what you can do is cut off the tops of the dead, your dead flowers. If you're able to leave anything from 6 to sort of 18 inches of height of the dead flower stems still there on the ground, then these are the ones that those bees will then chew into and make their nests. But they're not in there when you do the cutback, they're going to use them this spring. So these plants, you leave them this spring, the bees chew into them, and then they're going to use them all of this following summer through the winter, and next spring is when bees will emerge from these tubes. So you can cut them back, but of course these plants are going to grow taller than where the dead stems that you've left, and they are going to hide that. So, inside these tubes, that's our future baby bee nests. But at the base of these plants, you might have, if you listen to my full talk, you might remember that a lot of our butterflies, their caterpillars, actually crawl down and spend the winter right at the base of the plant in all this, area, right around. And they're being protected by the leaves that fell off the plant and are keeping them warm and snug. So when you do your cleanup, try and leave the leaves and stuff that are at the base of these plants, because that's where the caterpillars are still hanging out. And in fact, under all these leaves, just like I showed you with the lunar moth, there can be lots of different caterpillars and moths that are still fast asleep in all these leaves. And some animals like fireflies, they actually stay in this leaf litter until July, when, when they emerge and are flying around flashing. So the larvae of fireflies are in this leaf litter until then. So really, if you don't have to clean up the leaves, leave the leaves where they are, because, they're still going to be used all the way and through till, the summer by those different animals. So, but if you want to know, when is it safe to do the cleanup? For the most part, I say about when it's been 55 degrees Fahrenheit for a week in the daytime, then you can start to, do the cleanup. But a much easier way to remember that is just like when the grass starts to grow enough to need cutting, that's when most of our butterflies and moths and bees will have emerged from the leaves. So you can do some cleaning up at that point if you want, and mostly you're not going to disturb much, but if you can leave some mess, that's going to leave some areas for those fireflies. And then sometimes people ask me, but it's going to look a mess. I don't want my yard to look like that. And the perfect solution to keeping your neighbors happy about any mess you make is to put signage up. As soon as people know that you haven't just been a lazy gardener, that you're doing this deliberately, they are much more accepting of the fact that what you're doing is for a purpose. And I always say, the very front of your yard, right next to the street, use small areas of mulch there, cut back harder. But the further you get away from the street, the more you can leave areas looking more natural. And then it's obvious to people you are caring for your yard, but you're just trying to help our wildlife. Okay, number 3 on my list was planting some warm season grasses. So things like this beautiful Shenandoah switchgrass here that will add structure and color to your yard are absolutely beautiful. But the very dense grass bundles that you get at the base of these native warm season grasses are an area where a lot of bumblebees actually will make either overwinter homes, or some of them will make a little hive in here. But you don't have to be concerned, because a bumblebee nest can be pretty small. There might only be 15 bumblebees in a bumblebee hive. So you, for the most part, will never know. I actively go out hunting for bumblebee nests, and I can't find them. They're very secretive, and they're not aggressive, and they're not going to defend those nests. So you don't have to worry about having these fuzzy little bumblebees in your yard. And then, of course, if we want to encourage pollinators, the last thing we want to do is plant a plant that's going to attract a bee, but then kill it. And unfortunately, a lot of plants that you buy at kind of the big box stores have been treated with systemic pesticides. Now, the great thing in Maryland is that they passed a law that if it has been treated with systemic pesticides, it has to be labeled. Now, they put a label on that makes it seem like being treated like this is a good thing. It says it's going to protect it from aphids, whiteflies, beetles, mealybugs, and other unwanted pests. But it will also kill any pollinator that comes, because systemic pesticides mean it's in every part of the plant, from the leaves to the nectar and the pollen. Okay, so it does impact our pollinators when you use these plants. And of course, like, if you are the kind of person, as soon as you see a bug in your yard, that, the first thing you do is reach for the pesticides and spray, then you probably don't want to attract pollinators, because you're just going to, hurt those when you're do spraying. So using the least strong type of pesticide that you can, so things like soapy water, is always going to be better, and then using them very targeted on specific plants. I mean, I have to admit, sometimes I use things like soapy water sprays on my vegetables, because I don't want my lettuce covered with aphids, but I'm very careful to just target the lettuce. I know that there's no pollinators visiting, just the leaves of my lettuce. So being very thoughtful about how and when you use these products is really important. And then, of course, before I get into the plants, I wanted to say, where can you find them? And the great thing is that this time of year is actually easier to source the native plants that I'm going to talk about than at any other time, because there are lots and lots of native plant sales going on. A lot of the sales have multiple companies that come and sell at them, so you get lots of choice. And like, there's one coming up. The next one that I could find is at the National Arboretum. So you have the beautiful environment of the Arboretum to while you're perusing your native plants, and you can see those same plants, of course, in the Arboretum, and so get an inspiration of how big each of them will grow. If you want to know where and when these native plant sales are happening, any of our Native Plant Society websites have a link to all both native plant nurseries and the native plant sales. So you can just go to your local one of these, whether that's the Maryland Native Plant Society, Virginia Native Plant Society, or the Plant Nova Natives. All of these have information on their websites about where you can go to buy the plants. So, and then my final thing was think big. And that's the wonder of planting for pollinators in the spring, is it's the easiest type of planting for pollinators to do. Now, do you remember I talked about our bumblebee queen and how hard she has to work in the springtime to feed all of her babies? She has to collect this big pile of pollen and make that little nectar pot. To do that every day, she needs to visit about 6,000 flowers to collect that pollen and nectar. And if you look around your yard and you just look at the plants on the ground, you're going to go, I don't think I have 6,000 flowers. But if you plant one of these flowering trees or shrubs, something like these service berries and the red buds, they are covered with spring blossom. And that is where these bees can find 6,000 flowers to visit. So two of the most spectacular, obviously, that many of you, you're going to see because they're commonly used for street plantings, is the red bud, which is in the pea family. And so it's a plant that a lot of bees specialize in using because they have to open up the flowers to access the pollen. And like I say, service berries, you not only get this beautiful spring blossom, but it also has berries that are edible for us. I actually like them more than blueberries. I think they're delicious. The birds love them, and then they get terrific fall color. So, literally the service berry does it all. And one of the things I was going to say is at the end, and I know we have a link that allows you to pull up a PDF that has all the plants, the trees and shrubs that I'm going to be talking about. And I'm going to have them again at the end of the presentation so that you can just take a screenshot of all these plants I'm talking about. So, but a couple of plants you might not have thought about before are there's native hawthorns that have these beautiful spring blossoms, and lots of they also have red berries that the birds like, and they have thorns on them, which can be quite useful if you have issues with deer in your yard. It helps to protect these plants from deer. And as I said, they have these berries that will make you an attractive location for gorgeous birds like this cedar waxwing to come in and eat. Another underused plant is the beautiful Native American plum. It grows into just a medium-sized small tree here with this beautiful spring blossoms. But just, it's just a really attractive plant to use in your yard. There are lots of different viburnums that you can plant in your yard, but probably one of the lesser known ones that I really love is the Blackhaw Viburnum. As with all the viburnums, it has these big clusters of white flowers. So in the springtime, the whole tree is just covered with these white blossoms that then turn into attractive like black berries that hang and will be there through the fall, as you also get this beautiful fall coloration. So look for that one, the Viburnum prunifolium, which means cherry-leaved viburnum. So the leaves look like cherries. So, but if you have enough space in your yard, you can put big trees in your yard. So a lot of us, when we think of shade trees, often think of just like the oaks and the maples. But especially the maples are very overplanted. There's lots of those everywhere. So if you want like a slightly more interesting tree, ones that are very good trees is the beautiful black gum. This is a tupelo, and a lot of people will plant them because of this amazing fall color. But you might also have eaten tupelo honey. Now, that honey comes from the white tupelo, and the local species is actually this one, the black tupelo. But just like the white one, it is covered with blossoms in the springtime, but they're very small. So as people, we don't really notice them, but the bees definitely will hunt them out and, use those extensively in the springtime. Another great tree that's not planted as much is the native basswood, the American basswood, which is the Tilia is the species for this one. And these leaf out flower a little later. So this is in June. So they're popular not only with our bumblebees and other bees, but you get a lot of butterflies visiting this plant. It has a gorgeous scent. If you've ever walked down the street that has basswoods lining the street, you'll know the amazing smell that you get from these trees. A very early blooming tree is willow, and willow is not always an easy tree to use in your yard. It definitely really likes wet conditions. You have to be careful not to plant it near like water lines and stuff like that, because it can be quite aggressive, like seeking that water out. But if you have a more natural area that's got some wet, you can think about trees that are bigger, such as the black willow or the pussy willow, the Salix discolor here, that has these lovely fluffy blossoms. They're really popular for people to cut and bring them in and force them inside. Okay, so I'm going to look at a few shrubs now. So I can say trees, they're so easy. You just plant them, put a tree guard up to make sure that the deer don't rub them until they get big and strong enough. But otherwise, very easy maintenance. And the same again with a lot of these shrubs. You put them in. You just often need to protect them if they're in the PowerPoint PDF. Sorry, I'm going to give you. It tells you whether deer do like to eat them or not. So if they deer do eat them, you do need to protect them until they get bigger. But lots of these ones, they're just put in and kind of forget kind of plants. So but they will reward you with these amazing blossoms. So obviously blueberries, you can plant them just for their wildlife value, or you could plant them because you want to eat the blueberries, and that's totally fine, because either way, it's going to be bumblebees coming and doing that buzz pollination that will pollinate your blueberries. Two that you might not have heard about as often is ninebark. Is a really spectacular shrub. It's become more commonly used, and there are many cultivars that now have red leaves. But for the most part, I try and encourage people to use the more straight species without those red leaves, because the red is caused by anthocyanins that are actually toxic to a lot of different insects. And so you're planting a bush that can't help feed pollinators such as butterflies in your yard if their caterpillars want to eat those leaves. And then if you don't have deer, New Jersey tea is, a really amazingly fragrant, covered with blossoms in the springtime, a lovely shrub to put in your yard. So there are some shrubs that often get planted because of their winter interest, such as the red twig dogwood here, or the winterberry, because of all the beautiful, red berries that are still kind of there. In some areas, not the birds haven't eaten them all yet, so it really gives a lovely pop of color in the winter time. But these trees also have flowers, and especially with the winterberry, we don't pay much attention to them because they're very tiny little flowers on them. But we actually have specialist bees. Remember when I talked about the bees that only go to a particular plant to collect the pollen from? And there's a whole group of bees that only collect pollen from members of the holly family. And winterberry is one of those flowers. So by putting this plant in your yard, you can support a bee that otherwise couldn't live in your yard. And it is just one of those really tiny ones that I was talking about that are just the size of a kind of grain of rice. So if you have just 1 or 2 winterberries in your yard, those tiny bees only need to visit about 15 of these flowers in order to collect enough food to feed their babies. So because the bees are so tiny, you can support a lot of bees that size in your yard. It's really like even just 1/10 of an acre for a bee that size is like living in Yellowstone for how much habitat you're able to provide them. Red twig dogwoods are all the shrubby dogwoods, the silky, the grey, and the red twig dogwood here also have specialist bees that come and visit their flowers. So the flowers are these smaller clustered ones, look more like a viburnum or something than the flowering dogwood that we kind of think about with those big white petals. But the clustered flowers are also super attractive and, like I say, have a specialist bee. Now, where you might have been thinking all this time, I've just gone bee, 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 bee. And so it's time to talk about some of those other pollinators. If you have the right conditions in your yard and have some shade and you have some acidic soils, then native azaleas are, one of the things that you could think about planting. And they, are like underplanted compared to the non-native azaleas that fill our yards. But if you look at those non-native ones in the springtime, you're not going to see almost any pollinator action on them. And that's because, as I say, they're not a native one. So our native pollinators just don't use those flowers. But the native azaleas, I just want you to have a look at these long, anthers that are coming out of them. This is where the pollen is. They on the end of these stamen. And you can see that if you were a bee, you would actually go right to the base of these flowers to get nectar. And your body wouldn't go anywhere near these stamen to collect the pollen. So the native azaleas are designed to be pollinated by our large butterflies, such as this swallowtail. And as they kind of flap their wings to balance themselves on the flowers, their wings keep hitting all of these stamen and collect the pollen, and then when they get to the next flower, there'll be stigma that they can transfer that pollen to. So it really is just amazing to watch the swallowtail butterflies visiting these just spectacular flowers. This one is the pinkster. The flame, has this beautiful orange kind of to reds colors as well. So all of them, if you have the conditions to grow them in, are spectacular plants. Okay, so I've focused mostly on trees and shrubs, and that really is where a lot of the springtime action for our pollinators is. But, if you don't have space for those, there are, indeed lots of small spring flowers that will support our pollinators. And you can't get a more beautiful one than the Virginia bluebells. Named for its color and shape, obviously. And this shape just really is appealing to bumblebees that love bell-shaped flowers. They love crawling inside of these flowers. They're very, very deer resistant. I have herds of deer through my yard, and they never touch the bluebells. They grow in early spring and give you this amazing pop of color. They do then die back afterwards. So I aim to plant them with ferns, like especially ostrich fern that comes up a little later, and those leaves come up and kind of hide the Virginia bluebells as they start to die back. If you don't have deer, things like the wild geranium will put on a spectacular spring display for you, and the leaves do last longer. And then if you have more sun areas, you can think about things like the lanceleaf coreopsis and the penstemon. So this is Foxglove Pencilman or Penstemon digitalis. And again, these have those bell-shaped flowers. So here I've took a picture of a bumblebee crawling right inside those flowers. In both sun or shade, the superadaptable golden alexanders is a terrific plant to grow. And it's actually the host plant. The leaves are the leaves that eastern tiger swallowtails eat their leaves. So sometimes people are like, what do they eat if they're not eating the black swallowtails, if they're not eating parsley and dill and thyme, the plants that aren't natives? And this golden alexanders is one of the native hosts for those butterflies. Then I remember I taught you a little bit about the pea flowers in terms of that they need to be opened up by a strong pollinator. So in full sun areas, the wild blue indigo is a spectacular plant. You get these shoots of purpley blue flowers in the springtime. The foliage is really attractive. I really like it. The scientific name is Baptisia australis, and I think it's because the leaves do look like they come from a more tropical area. They don't look native. They have a bluey green color and are very attractive. And then because they're in the pea family, you actually get kind of pods appearing. Pods appearing on. Where did I go? Oh, there we go. Pods appearing at each of these flowers. So the pea family have this petal that sits on the top, a banner, and then two side petals that close over the stigma and stamen. So to access the pollen, you actually have to push open those petals. So as you can see, the bumblebee here is strong enough and big enough. It can use its back legs to push open those petals. And when it does that, the pollen, the stigma and stamen pop up, and its belly gets all covered with the pollen. So when it goes to the next flower, it'll do that pollination. So a lot of these pea family need this big, strong pollinator. If you saw my talk in the fall, you'll know that I always encourage people to, when they're planting, to think about planting layers, that you have something like a redbud or a serviceberry or a ninebark as a structural taller plants, that you can have some flowers growing underneath that, but then you should have a base layer of plants that help cover the ground. And these are really important for pollinators to overwinter in this covered area. And some plants that I kind of covered in my last talk, but emphasizing again that you can use for this ground layer are things like the Tiarella foam flower, which has beautiful semi-evergreen leaves through the winter, and then this amazing spring display of blossoms. Golden ragwort, which is one of my go-to plants to give ground cover in areas that are otherwise hard to cover, but they have spring blossoms and a specialist bee that comes to visit them. Coral bells and violets are all great ideas. So the golden ragwort, like I say, you can use these to cover areas that otherwise are hard to plant. It's a really terrific plant to think about. And the coral bells comes in lots and lots of different cultivars. So this is heuchera, and there is a specialist bee that comes just to its flowers. But if you're interested in looking more at the very huge numbers of cultivars that you're going to find in shops for this plant, the Mount Cuba Center actually have a research report where they've looked at all the different cultivars, well, not all of them because there's so many, but lots of the cultivars, and they analyze realize which ones of them are still attractive to pollinators and which ones, don't work as well. So that's some really good information you can find from Mount Cuba. And those violets that so many people think of as just weeds in your yard, don't forget that those are the host plant for these spectacular fritillaries. And it's a really amazing little caterpillar that will eat the leaves. But they're very hard to find, these caterpillars. They're really great at hiding underneath the leaves. But by letting these things that sometimes people just treat as weeds thrive in your yard, you can support this amazing pollinator. So usually people are like, but what about the weeds? Shouldn't we leave the weeds? And indeed, things like these lamiums, these mint family, the purple dead nettle and the henbit, and even dandelions do get used by spring pollinators. Bumblebees will visit both of these plants. So if you have an area where you don't mind leaving them, feel free to leave them. But by planting those, really attractive plants, you can, support bees, a lot more bumblebees with a serviceberry or a redbird than you can by just leaving areas of these plants. But the big difference is usually you will get these plants if you're not using a lot of pesticides. So for me, it's like a sign that you are like making the effort to not use so much chemicals. And those you're going to just like do less work because you're not doing as much spraying, and you're going to have more support for our pollinators. So finally, the last pollinator that's going to come visit us is the hummingbird. So sometime in early May, the hummingbirds arrive with us. And I know when the hummingbirds are about to arrive because it's always at exactly the same time as the columbine is flowering. So if you want to have the flowers available for the hummingbirds as soon as they arrive, columbine is a great plant, as is the red buckeye, which is very, very deer resistant. So I have this one in my yard and gives a lot of nectar for our hummingbirds. So as I said, you didn't have to write all that down, because if you want to take a quick screenshot, here are the trees and shrubs that I talked about. And we just have a few minutes to cover any questions if so I'm sure some topics came up. So
Absolutely, Claire. We do have lots of questions. I'm going to bring us back to the beginning of the presentation. We've got a question about bumblebees. That nectar pot that you were talking about, what is it made of, and do the bees make it?
Yes, they make that. So all bees can make a kind of wax substance. They actually sort of exude it from underneath their armpits, which sounds totally weird that they could like make wax from their body. But can I just say that humans can do this too? So you have it inside your ears, they have it coming out the sides of their bodies, and they take it and they can shape it to make that nectar pot. So yep, bees can do it.
All right, our next question is, can insects and butterfly larvae overwinter in compost piles of shredded leaves?
So they can crawl into the leaves once they're shredded. So if you want to make an area look neater, so the leaves fall onto your lawn, you collect them up with like a lawnmower or something. So you got this big pile of shredded leaves. If you then put those leaves underneath your trees, if you imagine like any tree that you plant, it's really best not to have grass growing all the way up to it. You should have what's a soft landing, so an area around that tree that's doesn't have grass that would compete with that tree. So if you pile your leaves there, the insects as they come out of the tree will crawl in and hide in those areas to overwinter. So yeah, if you can not, some of the insects will be on the leaves, and so when you shred, some of them do get killed. So if leaves fall in an area, you can just leave them. Don't shred them. But if you've collected them up off your lawn, it's perfectly good. It's really good to just shred them, and then attractively, they do stay better when they're shredded. Sometimes they'll blow around if you leave them unshredded.
Thank you, Claire. Our next question is, does deer repellent spray affect pollinators?
So normally no, and I do use some. I tend to use it on my plants. Some of my plants, I try not to grow stuff that's like deer lettuce that they're just going to eat all the time, but I definitely have some plants that deer will eat in spring, like the asters and goldenrods. So I will often spray them just when they have that lovely spring fresh growth, which is when they are, it's like baby spinach to a deer. They taste really good then. So I often will do some treatments in that early spring period, and then the leaves get bigger, older, tougher, and then my deer leave them alone, so I don't have to respray. I don't spray on the blossoms themselves as much as I can. A lot of the pollinators are finding their flowers through scent. That's why bloom flowers smell so good. It's not actually for us. It's just a side benefit that flowers smell great for us. They smell great to attract the pollinators. So if you're using a lot of sprays that is going to mask that scent, the pollinators might not find them. But if the only alternative is the deer eat those blossoms, well, better to have the blossoms, even if, because after a few days, usually the smell will probably wear off enough, and the blossom smell will overpower that smell. So yeah, if you have to use them to keep the deer off.
Thank you, Claire. And then do you have a specific deer spray that you like to use in connection with that?
Yeah, I'm trying to remember the brand that I use. It's one that I've tried a few different ones, and it's actually a good idea to not stick with the same one, because eventually the deer figure it out. So I do change brands every so often. And my current one I really like because it still has you can smell at the back, it has the bad smell, but they've put mint as the most prominent smell, and it's so much better to spray with it because I mostly am smelling mint. And of course, mint is an unattractive smell to deer. They won't eat your mint. So yeah, that's my recommendation to keep your neighbors happy when you're spraying, is use the ones that have mint as part of the smell regime.
Thank you, Claire. And next question, are spring, usually non-native bulbs like crocuses useful for early emerging pollinators?
So I do have crocus in my yard. I must admit, I love that pop of spring color. I actually have them in my lawn because they grow and have flowered before the lawns need mowing. And I've never really seen much native bee action on them. Some of my neighbors have beehives, and I see a lot of European honeybees using them. They love them. So you can certainly keep, the European honeybees very happy. And sometimes I see some other early pollinators like flies will use them as well. So, but yeah, mostly the native bees go to native plants, with the exception of some of those mint aggressive weeds that we were talking about. I didn't include the worst of the weeds that I just can't stand, which is creeping Charlie or gill on the ground or ground ivy. It's got lots of names. You know what I'm talking about if you have it, because it's very aggressive. It creeps in. And actually bumblebees do use that one as well. So it has one redeeming feature to its being a terrible plant to have to weed.
Thanks, Claire. And we were talking about this before the presentation got started, but what shade plants are good for pollinators?
Okay, so obviously some of the understory trees are quite adapted to living in shade. You'll get more flowers from, your dogwoods and your serviceberries and your redbuds if you have them in at least partial shade. So if you could put them on the edges of your shade areas. A lot of spring flowers will flower before the trees leaf out. So Virginia bluebells, full shade, not a problem. Columbine will flower in almost full shade. The wild geraniums that I talked about, full shade. Foam flower, heuchera, all those ones, and ragwort, actually, the golden ragwort, all of those will flower in full shade.
Fabulous. Thank you. And can you remind us, Claire, when did you say we could clear underbrush? Was that in March or more toward May?
Yes. So mostly, like I said, there's never one date. Have we had a warm spring or a cold spring? But what never changes is the date that your grass needs cutting for the first time, because the grass will grow when it's been warm enough for a while. And that's when it's been 55 degrees for a while, for a week or two. The grass will start to grow. You look at it, needs cutting. that's the time that most of those spring emerging butterflies and bees and everything will be out of the plants that you want to clear back. But as I always try to remind people, the firefly larvae are there until July. So if you can leave some areas that they can still be running around in there in the leaf litter, hunting snails and slugs. And who doesn't want an animal that hunts snails and slugs in their yard? So, they leave some habitat for the fireflies, and then your kids or grandkids still get the joy of those summer fireflies.
Well, speaking of fireflies, Claire, would it be okay to move leaves to a different location without damaging the larva, like putting a pile on the side of your yard versus right in the garden?
Yeah. So if it's always going to be better, if you have, if they're in an area you can leave them, perfect. If you want to clean up that area, try and leave some leaves right at the base of plants, because most of the overwintering pollinators really dig down very close to the base of plants. So just leave a few around those leaves. The rest of them, feel free to move. If you're just raking them, the pollinators for the most part are going to go with them.
Thank you so much, Claire. And I want to thank you for an excellent presentation. And I want to thank everyone who attended today.